The county clerk almost threw the envelope away because the stamp had half peeled off in the rain. Inside was a folded property survey from 1978, a faded tax receipt for $23, and a handwritten note signed by a man who'd been dead for 30 years. 3 weeks later, the State Transportation Board halted a $35 million highway expansion outside Millfield County without explanation. Reporters blamed environmental reviews. Contractors blamed permit delays. But inside a temporary office trailer beside the construction zone, senior executives from Mid-South Infrastructure Group stared at the same narrow strip of farmland on a survey map and realized a retired grain farmer named Walter Grady might quietly own the only legal access route their entire project depended on. Walter Grady lived alone in a weathered farmhouse 3 miles outside Millfield, where the road narrowed into cracked asphalt and soybean fields swallowed the horizon. Every morning started the same way. He woke before sunrise, boiled water in a dented tea kettle older than most county employees, and sat at the kitchen table beside a stack of handwritten crop ledgers tied together with faded twine. He wrote everything down. Rainfall. Diesel purchases. Fence repairs. Property tax dates. Even coffee prices from the co-op diner. People joked about it. At the grain elevator, younger farmers called him the accountant. Walter never reacted. He simply folded receipts into his shirt pocket and kept listening. The highway announcement arrived in late September. State officials partnered with Mid-South Infrastructure Group to build a commercial transport corridor connecting Millfield to a larger interstate route. The project promised jobs, distribution centers, and rising land values. Local news stations celebrated it for weeks. Survey crews appeared almost overnight. At first, Walter ignored them. Then he noticed orange marker stakes crossing the narrow gravel access path behind his soybean field. The path barely looked important. 2 tire tracks bordered by drainage grass. Most people assumed it belonged to the county. Walter walked out carrying a thermos of coffee and quietly asked a survey worker what the markers were for. Temporary easement access, the man said without looking up. Walter asked who authorized it. The worker pointed toward a white project SUV parked near the road. Inside sat a regional acquisitions manager named Daniel Mercer. Expensive watch. Clean boots that had never touched real mud. Walter waited patiently beside the SUV window while Mercer finished a phone call. Finally Mercer lowered the glass halfway. Walter calmly explained that the gravel strip might not belong to the county at all. Mercer barely glanced at him. "Sir, we already completed title review." Walter nodded once. "I figured you'd say that." Mercer gave the practiced corporate smile of someone trained to end conversations quickly. "If there's a concern, call the number on the notice." Walter removed a folded property receipt from his jacket pocket. The paper looked ancient and soft from decades of handling. Mercer didn't even take it. "That old paperwork won't override state filings." Walter stood silently for a few seconds. No anger. No threat. Just observation. Then he folded the receipt again with extreme care and returned it to his pocket. The humiliation itself was tiny. Nobody yelled. Nobody insulted him directly. But nearby workers smirked as Walter walked back toward the farmhouse carrying his untouched thermos. That evening, he unlocked a filing cabinet in the back bedroom beside an old deer rifle and stacks of county plat maps. He spread documents across the bed under a dim yellow lamp. Tax receipts. Drainage agreements. Handwritten notes from his father. Old agricultural easement maps. Then he stopped at a folded county survey dated 1978. Someone had marked a narrow strip of land with blue ink and handwritten initials. Walter stared at it for a very long time. Outside, rain tapped softly against the metal roof while trucks continued moving equipment toward the future highway site less than a mile away. The next morning, Walter drove 30 minutes to the Millfield County Library instead of the grain elevator. He requested archived Transportation Commission minutes from 1981. The librarian looked surprised. "Those aren't digitized." Walter nodded calmly. "I know. 2 hours later, surrounded by dusty binders and handwritten county approvals, Walter found the first inconsistency. Not proof. Not victory. Just enough to make him stop writing crop totals in his notebook and begin writing dates, parcel numbers, and names instead. Meanwhile, construction crews continued pouring concrete supports beside the access route they believed was already secured. None of them noticed Walter photographing old survey maps beneath the library copier light. None of them realized the tiny receipt Mercer refused to touch might connect to a forgotten agricultural corridor agreement filed decades before Mid-South's lawyers were even born. And none of them understood that Walter Grady had spent most of his life quietly recording things because he trusted paper more than people. Walter returned to the county library every morning for 6 straight days. Always the same routine. He arrived when the doors opened at 8. He carried a black notebook, a thermos of coffee wrapped in a faded shop towel, and a cardboard folder sealed with rubber bands. He rarely spoke unless necessary. By noon, the librarians began setting archived binders aside for him before he even asked. Most people searching county records looked frustrated within an hour. Walter looked calm. That unsettled people more. He studied Transportation Commission minutes from the late 1970s, drainage district approvals from the early 1980s, and agricultural zoning maps drawn by hand before computer systems existed. Entire sections were faded nearly white. Some pages smelled faintly of mildew and machine oil. But Walter noticed patterns. Names repeated. Parcel numbers shifted. Road descriptions changed slightly across decades. And one phrase kept appearing beside a narrow strip of undeveloped access land behind his soybean field. Protected Agricultural Transfer Corridor. The wording appeared in 3 separate county references spanning 12 years. Walter copied each one by hand into his notebook. Not photographs. Handwritten copies. He trusted his eyes more when writing slowly. On Thursday afternoon, he requested a storage box from the archive basement. The librarian hesitated. Nobody's opened that since before COVID. Walter simply waited. 20 minutes later, a dusty records carton appeared on a rolling cart beside his table. Inside were folded highway planning drafts from 1982 tied together with brittle string. Walter untied them carefully. One map changed everything. An original transportation draft showed the county rejecting permanent commercial development over a specific agricultural transfer route connecting grain carriers to emergency flood roads during seasonal washouts. The protected corridor had never been formally dissolved because the county board deadlocked during a funding dispute in 1984. Walter leaned back slowly in his chair. Not because he was excited. Because he understood what it meant. If the corridor still legally existed, then Mid-South's highway interchange might be blocking protected agricultural access without proper termination filings. Which meant the environmental approvals could become vulnerable. Which meant the state contracts themselves could stall. All because of a narrow strip of gravel most executives considered worthless. Walter copied parcel references for nearly 2 more hours before quietly leaving the library. Outside, heavy machinery thundered across the construction site west of town. Concrete pylons stood half-finished against the gray autumn sky. Local diners were full of contractors celebrating overtime pay. Millfield believed the highway was inevitable. Walter drove instead to the county recorder's office. The young clerk behind the desk barely looked up. "You need current deeds or historical?" "Historical." "Back how far?" "Far enough that nobody checks anymore." The clerk gave a small laugh before realizing Walter wasn't joking. 3 filing cabinets later, Walter located easement amendments tied to flood management access routes from 1979. One referenced a handwritten attachment that was now missing from the county file. Missing documents usually meant dead ends. But Walter noticed something else. A signature. County Surveyor, Harold Baines. The same Harold Baines who had once leased hunting land beside Walter's father decades earlier. Walter closed the file carefully. That night, he drove to a small farmhouse outside Bell Creek where Harold's widow still lived. The porch light glowed dim against the darkness. Walter removed his cap before knocking. Mrs. Baines recognized him immediately. You still keeping records, Walter? Yes, ma'am. She invited him inside. The house smelled like cedar wood and old coffee. Framed survey maps hung beside family photographs. Walter explained the highway situation quietly, never exaggerating, never accusing. Mrs. Baines listened without interruption. Then she disappeared into a hallway closet and returned carrying a narrow metal tube sealed with tape. Harold kept copies of everything after the county board fights. Walter carefully opened the tube at the kitchen table. Inside was a hand-marked survey overlay from 1983. And attached to it, the missing agricultural corridor agreement. Signed. Stamped. Recorded. But never digitized. Walter stared silently at the paper while the tea kettle rattled softly on the stove behind them. For the first time, the issue became dangerous. Not emotional. Not symbolic. Dangerous. Because the agreement specifically prohibited permanent obstruction of the corridor without unanimous landholder consent from every surviving parcel inheritor. Walter's family still owned one of those parcels. Meaning Mid-South Infrastructure may have broken state approval conditions before construction even began. The next morning, Daniel Mercer received an email from a junior legal reviewer asking why an elderly farmer had suddenly requested certified copies of transportation corridor filings from 1983. Mercer almost ignored it. Almost. But 20 minutes later, he quietly canceled his lunch meeting and called the project's legal department instead. The first corporate meeting about Walter Grady lasted 11 minutes. Inside a temporary project office overlooking the construction zone, Daniel Mercer sat across from two regional attorneys from Mid-South Infrastructure Group while trucks moved dirt outside the trailer windows. One attorney flipped through printed county records with visible irritation. "This corridor language is obsolete," he said. Mercer nodded too quickly. "That's what I assumed." The second attorney remained quiet longer than the others. Finally she asked a simple question. Did anyone secure explicit extinguishment approval from surviving parcel holders? Nobody answered immediately. Outside, a crane alarm echoed across the site. Mercer reached for his coffee but stopped halfway. "I'll verify with title compliance." The attorney closed the file slowly. "You should have already verified." That afternoon, Walter sat alone at his kitchen table beneath the soft hum of a ceiling fan that clicked once every rotation. Spread before him were three objects. The 1978 tax receipt. The signed corridor agreement. And an old livestock feed ledger belonging to his father. The ledger itself looked meaningless. Water stains. Pencil marks. Grain tallies from 40 years earlier. But hidden inside the back cover was a folded county survey map Walter remembered seeing only once as a child. His father had hidden important papers inside ordinary farm records because, in his words, nobody steals boring things. Walter unfolded the map carefully. A second handwritten notation appeared beside the protected corridor boundary. Smaller than the official survey markings. Almost invisible. Emergency transfer access preserved under flood contingency vote. Walter immediately recognized the signature beneath it. County Commissioner Elias Thorne. Unlike the other documents, this notation connected the agricultural corridor directly to state emergency infrastructure classifications from the early 1980s. That meant the issue potentially involved not only land access disputes but also transportation contingency compliance. The implications widened instantly. Walter leaned back silently while rain drifted across the kitchen windows. Then he wrote 4 names into his notebook. County Recorder. Transportation Board. Environmental Review Office. State Infrastructure Compliance Division. No threats. No lawsuits. Just process. That evening, Mid-South's internal legal team began running independent archive reviews in 3 separate counties. Mercer stayed inside the office trailer long after sunset while outside floodlights illuminated half-finished overpasses rising from mud and concrete. The atmosphere changed. Workers still joked near equipment yards. But management stopped smiling. Emails multiplied. A compliance officer requested original corridor extinguishment filings. None could be found. Another executive asked whether construction insurance covered historical access disputes. Nobody answered directly. By Friday morning, Mid-South executives ordered Mercer to visit Walter personally. Mercer arrived in a black SUV just after dawn. Walter was repairing a fence post beside the gravel access strip when the vehicle stopped near the mailbox. Mercer stepped out carefully this time. Different posture. Different tone. "You should have contacted legal representation earlier," he said. Walter kept tightening fence wire. "I contacted you first." Mercer watched him work for several seconds. "We may be willing to discuss compensation." Walter nodded once but didn't stop working. "For what exactly?" "The access concern." Walter finally looked at him. "It's not an access concern." Mercer hesitated. "What is it?" Walter wiped dirt from his hands using an old cloth tucked into his back pocket. "It's a corridor your company certified didn't exist." Silence settled between them. In the distance, construction machinery groaned against wet earth. Mercer attempted a controlled smile. "If there were filing inconsistencies, we can probably resolve this privately." Walter studied him carefully. Not angrily. Almost sympathetically. Then he asked the question Mercer feared most. "Did your lawyers ever review the contingency classifications tied to that corridor?" Mercer's expression changed immediately. "Only slightly. But enough." Walter saw it. And Mercer realized Walter saw it. That was the first moment the balance shifted. Not publicly. Not legally. Psychologically. Because Mercer now understood the old farmer wasn't guessing anymore. He knew something specific. Mercer left 15 minutes later after offering to continue discussions. Walter simply nodded and returned to repairing the fence. But inside the SUV, Mercer called Mid-South Legal before reaching the highway. His voice stayed controlled. "We may have a state compliance exposure." The line remained silent for a moment. Then someone asked, "How bad?" Mercer looked back toward Walter's farmhouse shrinking behind him. "I think he's still holding documents he hasn't shown us." That night, Walter drove to his daughter Caroline's home outside Millfield. She taught accounting at the community college and inherited her father's habit of storing paperwork in perfectly labeled boxes. At the kitchen table, Walter finally explained everything. Caroline listened quietly while flipping through the corridor agreement. Then she stopped at the feed ledger map. "You never told me Grandpa kept this." Walter stared into his untouched coffee. He thought someday somebody might need it. Caroline looked toward the window where distant highway lights flickered against the clouds. "You think they know how serious this is yet?" Walter folded the map carefully back into the ledger. "No," he said softly. "But they're beginning to." The first offer arrived by certified mail on a Monday morning. Walter signed for the envelope without expression, carried it inside, and placed it unopened beside the tea kettle while rain drifted across the soybean fields outside. Only after breakfast did he finally sit at the kitchen table and unfold the letter carefully with both hands. Inside was a formal proposal from attorneys representing Mid-South Infrastructure Group. The company offered $85,000 for immediate resolution of any outstanding property or access concerns related to Parcel Corridor Reference 14B. No admission. No acknowledgement. No mention of the protected agricultural agreement. Just money. Walter read the letter twice, then passed it across the table to Caroline, who had arrived before sunrise carrying 2 archive boxes from the college accounting office. "That was quick," she said quietly. Walter poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "They're afraid of timing." Caroline looked up. "Not the land." Walter shook his head once. "The schedule." That was the first thing Mid-South executives truly understood after their internal review weekend. Construction delays threatened penalties written directly into the state transportation contract. Every stalled week risked millions in financing exposure, subcontractor overruns, and political scrutiny. And now the corridor issue had begun spreading through departments that were never supposed to communicate with each other. Environmental compliance requested clarification. Insurance auditors requested historical reviews. A state transportation analyst flagged discrepancies between digitized surveys and original county maps. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Inside the temporary project headquarters, executives stopped discussing Walter by name. They referred to him instead as the corridor matter. That made it feel manageable. Contained. Procedural. But Daniel Mercer knew better. He'd watched Walter too closely. Men who bluff usually push hard. Walter barely pushed at all. Which meant he was waiting. Meanwhile, Walter and Caroline spent 3 straight evenings organizing documents across the farmhouse dining table beneath yellow lamplight. Old county maps were flattened beneath hardcover books. Receipts were arranged by year. Caroline created handwritten timelines connecting survey revisions, zoning amendments, and transportation filings from 4 separate agencies. The deeper they went, the worse it became. One missing approval led to another. One altered corridor description conflicted with 2 environmental filings submitted decades later. Then Caroline found something neither of them expected. A reference buried inside a 1991 drainage maintenance agreement. Protected emergency agricultural transfer designation remains active pending formal dissolution vote. Walter removed his glasses slowly. That's 11 years after the state said it was inactive. Caroline nodded. And they certified development clearance anyway. Silence settled across the room except for the soft whistle of the kettle beginning to boil again. The next offer arrived 3 days later. $200,000. Delivered not by mail this time, but in person. Mercer returned alone near dusk while Walter stacked split firewood beside the barn. The sky hung low and gray over the fields, and distant construction lights already glowed near the unfinished overpass. Mercer stood beside the truck for several seconds before speaking. We'd prefer not to involve state review boards. Walter kept stacking wood. That sounds expensive. Mercer ignored the comment. This can still end quietly. Walter placed another log onto the pile with measured care. Quiet isn't the same thing as correct. Mercer stepped closer. You understand what happens if this project stops? Walter nodded. Contractors lose money. Politicians panic. Lawyers bill overtime. That road brings jobs here. Walter looked toward the distant construction cranes. My father heard the same speech in 1983. Mercer's jaw tightened. That date again. Every conversation with Walter seemed to circle back toward years Mid-South barely understood. Mercer lowered his voice. What exactly are you planning to file? Walter finally faced him directly. Depends what the state asks. That answer unsettled Mercer more than any threat could have. Because Walter still wasn't demanding anything. He wasn't suing. Wasn't protesting. Wasn't contacting reporters. He was simply preparing records. And that meant the danger came from the documents themselves. Not from him. That night, Mid-South's legal department authorized emergency outside counsel from Chicago specializing in infrastructure injunctions. Executives began reviewing whether partial rerouting options existed if the corridor claim survived regulatory review. Engineers hated the numbers. A reroute would add nearly $11 million. A suspension during environmental reapproval could cost far more. Then, late Friday evening, the State Infrastructure Compliance Division emailed Mid-South requesting original supporting documentation for corridor termination certifications filed during preliminary approvals. Mercer read the email twice. Then immediately called corporate legal. Did someone contact the state already? No. Then why are they reviewing this now? Nobody answered for several seconds. Finally one attorney spoke quietly. Because somebody made them curious. Across town, Walter sat alone on his porch holding the original 1978 receipt between rough fingers worn from decades of farm labor. Caroline watched from the doorway while wind moved softly through the fields. You could have taken the money, she said. Walter folded the receipt carefully and slipped it back into his shirt pocket. They still think this is about buying land. In the distance, construction machinery continued working through the night beneath enormous floodlights. But for the first time since the project began, several sections of the site had gone completely dark. The stop order arrived at 6:12 on a cold Thursday morning. Most workers learned about it from silence. Concrete trucks lined up beside the unfinished interchange were suddenly turned around at the security gate. Excavators sat motionless beneath floodlights that had remained on all night. Supervisors checked phones repeatedly while subcontractors gathered near portable heaters drinking burnt coffee from paper cups. No announcement came at first. Just stillness. Then state vehicles began arriving. White sedans marked with transportation compliance seals rolled slowly through the muddy construction access roads while site managers rushed between trailers carrying folders and laptops. By 8 o'clock, rumors spread across Millfield faster than the morning fog. Permit issue. Environmental review. Funding dispute. Nobody knew. Inside Mid-South's temporary headquarters, executives already understood the truth. The State Infrastructure Compliance Division had issued an immediate procedural suspension pending verification of historical corridor certifications connected to protected agricultural transfer access routes. The language sounded technical. But the effect was catastrophic. Every active contract froze. Every construction clock stopped. And every question pointed backward toward paperwork nobody had reviewed carefully enough 30 years earlier. Daniel Mercer hadn't slept in nearly 2 days. Coffee cups covered his desk beside stacks of copied county maps and legal memos marked urgent review. Outside his trailer window, idle construction cranes stood frozen against a gray November sky. One executive from corporate headquarters joined the emergency conference call from Atlanta. "How exposed are we?" Nobody answered directly. Finally an outside attorney spoke. If the protected designation remained active during environmental certification, opposing counsel could argue the state approved development using incomplete land access disclosures. "We don't have opposing counsel," another executive snapped. The attorney paused. "You do now." Meanwhile, Walter Grady spent the morning repairing a grain auger behind his barn. He heard the news on the radio but showed almost no reaction. Caroline arrived shortly after sunrise carrying printed copies of the suspension order downloaded from the state website. "They froze everything," she said breathlessly. Walter tightened a rusted bolt without looking up. "For now." Caroline stared at him in disbelief. "You knew this could happen." Walter wiped grease from his hands slowly. "I knew paperwork spreads once enough people touch it. That was the problem Mid-South could no longer control. The issue had escaped private negotiation. Now state reviewers were requesting original filings directly from county archives, transportation records, and environmental agencies. Each office uncovered slightly different versions of corridor descriptions. Some classified the route as inactive. Others preserved protected access references. And every inconsistency raised another question. By afternoon, local reporters gathered outside the construction perimeter trying to understand why a major highway expansion had suddenly stalled. Mid-South released a carefully worded statement citing routine procedural clarification. Nobody inside the company believed that anymore. Especially after the state requested interviews with surviving landholders connected to the original agricultural corridor agreements. Walter received the call shortly before dinner. A compliance investigator asked whether he would attend a formal review session the following Tuesday. Walter simply said yes. Then he returned to his notebook. That evening, Mercer drove back to the farmhouse one final time. Not in a company SUV. In his own pickup truck. No tie. No corporate smile. Just exhaustion. Walter invited him onto the porch because the temperature had dropped sharply and wind rattled dead corn stalks across nearby fields. Caroline sat quietly near the doorway while Mercer removed an envelope from his coat pocket. $1.2 million, he said. No legal language this time. No formal presentation. Just a number. Walter looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. Mercer leaned forward. "If this becomes a public regulatory failure, people above me lose careers." Walter nodded once. "They should have read the records." Mercer rubbed both hands together against the cold. "You really kept all this for 40 years? Walter looked toward the dark field stretching behind the barn. My father did. Silence lingered heavily across the porch. Then Mercer asked the question that had haunted Mid-South for weeks. When did you realize the corridor could stop the project? Walter answered honestly. At the library. And after that? Walter took a slow sip of coffee from an old metal thermos. I realized your company never expected anyone to remember. Mercer lowered his eyes briefly. Because that part was true. The project depended on modern assumptions. Digitized records. Streamlined reviews. Dead files buried in forgotten storage rooms. Executives trusted databases more than handwritten maps folded inside old farm ledgers. And now a retired grain farmer with a tea kettle and decades of receipts had frozen a $35 million development without filing a single lawsuit. Mercer finally stood to leave. At the porch steps he stopped. What do you want, Walter? Walter looked at the envelope still resting untouched beside the chair. Then toward the dark highway project barely visible beyond distant construction lights. Finally he answered softly. I want the county records corrected. Mercer stared at him. Mercer stared at him for several seconds. Not because he didn't understand. Because for the first time, he realized Walter had never really been negotiating for money at all. The state review hearing took place inside the old Millfield County Administration building on a gray Tuesday morning. No television cameras entered the room. No dramatic speeches echoed through the hallways. Just fluorescent lights, folding tables, legal folders, and exhausted officials carrying years of overlooked paperwork into public record for the first time in decades. Walter arrived early wearing the same brown coat he wore to church and funerals. Caroline carried 2 archive boxes filled with labeled documents tied carefully in string. Neither of them spoke much while waiting outside hearing room B beside a flickering coffee machine. Across the hallway, attorneys representing Mid-South Infrastructure Group reviewed binders thick enough to resemble phone books. Daniel Mercer stood near the back wall staring through a courthouse window at the frozen construction cranes visible beyond town. The hearing itself began quietly. State compliance officers reviewed transportation filings. Environmental reviewers examined corridor classifications. County officials compared archived survey maps against digitized development approvals. Every table held different versions of the same land history. And every inconsistency traced backward toward one assumption. That nobody would ever examine the original records closely again. Walter answered questions calmly when asked. No speeches. No accusations. Just dates. Survey numbers. Storage box references. Names of commissioners long dead. At one point, a transportation attorney asked why he maintained copies of documents most landowners would have discarded years earlier. Walter thought for a moment before answering. My father said paper disappears faster when it embarrasses somebody. Silence settled briefly across the hearing room. Signed. Annotated. And directly connected to the unresolved emergency agricultural transfer designation. A state reviewer requested the original immediately. White gloves were brought in from county archives before handling it. That alone told everyone how serious the matter had become. For nearly 40 minutes, officials compared the handwritten notation against Transportation Board records from 1983. Finally, one senior compliance officer removed his glasses and leaned back heavily in his chair. The corridor was never legally dissolved. Nobody argued. Because the documents no longer allowed argument. Only consequences. By afternoon, the state issued formal findings. Mid-South Infrastructure had relied upon incomplete corridor termination assumptions during environmental certification submissions tied to the highway interchange development. Construction approvals would remain suspended until revised access compliance measures and landholder agreements were completed. The language remained procedural. Measured. But the financial impact landed like a collapse. Outside the building, reporters crowded the courthouse steps searching for reactions. Mid-South attorneys refused questions and moved quickly toward waiting vehicles. Walter simply walked past them carrying his archive box beneath one arm. One reporter called after him. Mr. Grady, do you feel vindicated? Walter stopped beside the courthouse railing. For a moment it seemed he might answer. Instead he looked across town toward the unfinished overpass cutting through old farmland beyond the grain silos. Then he said quietly, "It should have been checked the first time." And he kept walking. Over the following weeks, the county corrected historical land records connected to the agricultural corridor. State transportation officials approved a redesigned interchange route requiring Mid-South to purchase additional commercial property west of the original site at enormous cost. Executives privately called it a disaster. Millfield residents called it embarrassing. Walter called it paperwork. The final settlement came in December. Not millions. Not headlines. Mid-South agreed to finance permanent maintenance roads preserving the protected agricultural access corridor while reimbursing historical legal and survey expenses connected to the dispute. The agreement also required corrected public filings acknowledging the original protected designation. Walter signed the documents at the county recorder's office using the same black pen he carried for crop ledgers. Afterward, the recorder handed him certified copies stamped with official seals. Walter studied them silently for several seconds before folding them into a plain manila envelope. Outside, light snow drifted slowly across the courthouse square. Caroline asked if he was satisfied. Walter considered the question carefully. Then he nodded once. That evening, he returned home just before sunset. The farmhouse stood quiet against the winter fields while distant construction equipment moved again far beyond the redesigned project boundary. The highway would still be built. Just differently. Walter removed the old 1978 receipt from his shirt pocket one final time and placed it inside the filing cabinet beside his father's feed ledger and the original corridor map. Then he locked the drawer. In the kitchen, the tea kettle began to whistle softly. Walter poured himself coffee and sat alone at the table where the entire fight had quietly begun months earlier with a single folded receipt nobody at Mid-South had bothered to touch. Outside the window, snow continued falling across Millfield County while trucks rerouted miles away through land the corporation had once considered too expensive to buy properly. And somewhere inside a corrected county archive, preserved beneath official seals and fresh catalog numbers, the forgotten corridor finally existed again because one patient farmer had refused to let old paper disappear.